Welcome to the Glucose Neverlies podcast. I'm John Pemberton, a diabetes educator and researcher living with type 1 diabetes since 2008. I started the Glucose Neverlies website when my son tested positive for type 1 diabetes antibodies. In that moment, I realised I needed to build a resource strong enough to guide anyone who might care for him. At first, that meant writing clear, actionable management guides, but listening to Peter Attia's The Drive taught me something. Peter's conversations provide depth across nutrition, exercise, pharmacology, sleep, and much more. But I always find myself wondering, how does this information apply to people with type 1 diabetes? And this podcast is my attempt to fill that gap. I have access to the world's leading researchers and thought leaders in type 1 diabetes. That gives me a unique opportunity to combine lived experience, professional expertise, and cutting-edge science, and to share it all on here in conversation. But an important note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. These conversations share knowledge and experiences. They do not create a therapeutic relationship. So, let's get started. Welcome to the Glucose Neverlies podcast, and today I am really excited for a pregnancy with type 1 diabetes discussion with Professor Eleanor Scott. Now, you may or may not know of the Professor Eleanor Scott's name, but if you're within the diabetes circle, you definitely will. She is one of the UK's leading experts in pregnancy and maternal health. She runs a pregnancy and diabetes service at Leeds. She runs a research group. She shaped national policy. She's done international trials. She sits on international groups. Basically, the pedigree is absolutely there for someone to come and talk to us about type 1 diabetes and pregnancy. But more importantly for me, I've had the pleasure to meet Eleanor a couple of times, and we definitely share the same spirit in terms of happy to say what we see and also want what's best for people with diabetes regardless of whatever the current climate is. So it's a long introduction, but first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And I'm sure the listeners, whether they do or they don't know your name, what they'd certainly be interested to know is how you ended up. I've given obviously the titles, the things you've been involved with, but it didn't start there. Whereabouts did your journey start with getting involved with pregnancy and diabetes?
A very long time ago. I did my medical training. One of my very first jobs actually was doing diabetes. So that was over 30 years ago. And I really liked that sort of interaction and regular follow-up that we got at the time. And then I'm not quite sure how I ended up doing diabetes and pregnancy. It's probably because I'm female and I found it interesting. And over time I did it more and more. And then by the time I got my consultant post, that was the natural thing for me to do. So I've now been doing it several times a week for very many years. So that was it from a clinical point of view. And then I also then started, I'd always done some research, but that wasn't always necessarily in the field of pregnancy. But I was really interested in 24-hour rhythms, and the two things coincided when we started to get continuous glucose monitoring coming through. And for the very first time, we could see what's really happening with glucose across the 24-hour day. And then I realised sort of its applicability to really helping women with type 1 diabetes in pregnancy, and also, using it as a research tool to really delve in depth as to what's going on with glucose and how that can make a difference to pregnancy outcomes. And to be honest, it's gone from there. So I've been doing that quite a few years now.
There's a couple of things there that really, they first of all resonated with me, but they also speak to a wider set of things that keep coming up when I speak to people who have got an interest in a certain area. And the first one is, when you said, probably because I'm female. And I just think there's such a strong thing within healthcare with therapeutic relationships is people resonate with people who either look like them, are like them, sound like them, or there's something about them that they recognize in themselves that just allows an easy conversation. It allows taking on a suggestion with no barriers. And obviously a female to a female is much easier, especially when you're talking pregnancy, because especially if you shared that experience yourself, you know what they're about to go through and you know what you've been through. And I just think in terms of therapeutic relationship, the value of that is huge, is the first thing. And then the second thing, obviously from a continuous glucose monitoring perspective, the bit from a dietetic perspective that I really love about type 1 diabetes is CGM, because normally as a dietitian, if you talk about weight losses, if you do this in 3 to 6 months' time, you'll get a result. It's like, I'm not waiting that long. I want to know tomorrow. I want to know tomorrow what's going on. And CGM was just like, you make this change with your food, you'll see the results straight away. And to get that stimulus response, it just enhances the ability to kind of help people really fast. And it sounds like you picked that up as well.
Yeah, completely agree. It just has made, it's been a game changer. It really has. Yeah.
So, thinking about pregnancy then, so obviously within this area, my only personal experience is seeing my wife go through 2 pregnancies. So I know from a simple standpoint without diabetes in, that it is a challenging time for any female to go through pregnancy. We take type 1 diabetes out of the situation. So that's first of all to sort of there, but that's when my experience ends. So what would be really helpful to give an overview, because if anyone's seen any literature, they will know that in pregnancy, all of a sudden, the usual target ranges for glucose levels all of a sudden sharpen and get tighter. Why is that?
Okay. So, I mean, the target ranges are ones that we've devised over years. And the reason for them being tight, and the range that we aim for, is between 3.5 and 7.8. And the reason for that is that's probably about the closest that we can, we can get, that's most closely reproduces normality. And the reason for that is that babies are, extremely sensitive to raised levels of glucose, far less so low glucose levels. But at raised glucose levels, it affects everything right from the very beginning of pregnancy. So particularly, extremely high glucose levels at the start of pregnancy would interfere with the way that the baby first implants and the way that the placenta develops, and so it can interfere in that process and can lead to miscarriages and an increased risk of the baby not forming quite right. And by that I mean things like a heart defect or a spinal cord defect are the ones that we would see most closely related to a raised glucose. And then assuming that actually the placenta does develop and the baby does start to grow, then raised glucose levels from then on also can interfere with the way the baby develops and grows in size as well. And that's something that I'm sure will resonate with a lot of people, is everybody's aware that mums with diabetes tend to have bigger babies, and that's because baby basically sucks all the glucose out of mum and uses it itself to grow really big. And so we found through lots of research over the years that ideally we've got the best chances of helping mum and baby have a successful pregnancy the closer that we can get glucose in that tighter range. And that's not to say we think it's easy. We don't at all. We think it's incredibly hard, which is why technology has been so amazing over the last few years at really, really helping mums to get that.
So that definitely speaks to 2 things that I wanted to kind of find out about from a personal level, because I'm interested, but I'm sure we've had lots of listeners who've reached out and said, when are you going to do something for women? When are you going to do some proper women's sessions on here and kind of get some women-specific things? Because these times are really challenging and really hard. And what I kind of took from listening to that was, well, there's almost 3 phases. There's the pre-pregnancy situation where you would want glucose levels under control before the pregnancy takes, ideally. So there's that bit to consider on the front end. Then there's the 3 phases of pregnancy in terms of the 3 different trimesters, where things change quite radically in terms of insulin requirements, baby's growth, etc. So it's going to change across the time. And then we've obviously got the delivery, and then what happens after, depending whether mum is going to be breastfeeding or not breastfeeding. So there's almost like a 4-5-piece model that requires intensive support, it requires intensive monitoring, and something that's always stood out to me, and this is speaking to some of the adult nurses, is you'll have a person with type 1 diabetes whose maybe his glucose control has always been elevated and it's just whatever it is, but as soon as they get pregnant or they think about pregnant, boom, they're just kind of like on it. They're absolutely on it, because they know it's like a 9 to 12 month stretch that they can just do it for the baby and they can go for it and they can sustain it because they're doing it for almost someone else. Is that something you've seen?
Oh, that absolutely. It's like magic. Honestly, it really is. Yeah, that happens loads. So, yeah, somebody who's never had, good glucose control gets pregnant, and then the motivation's there. And I think it just says how it can be doable to get tight glucose control, but how much effort is involved to do that and how much motivation is needed to do that. And there are very few occasions in life when actually those two things come together. It's a short period of time and there's a really, really good reason. But yeah, we see that absolutely low.
And that's great because that's, you're absolutely right to live with type 1 diabetes and put that level of intense input for a lifetime for 99% of people is not sustainable because you've got a job, you've got kids, you've got so many other responsibilities. You can't do that level of focus, but with the opportunity to do that focus, you maybe have that. So if we have the ideal situation, I know not everyone plans pregnancy because that's just not the way that life is, but if someone's planning pregnancy, what kind of lead up is ideal going into it in terms of a period of in target glucose control, and what are you calling that? And then also, what are some of the other things that you are trying to optimize for to get the best environment for a pregnancy? For example, folic acid, iodine, vitamin D, those sorts of things. What's the kind of pre-workup? If you had the ideal, a lady comes to you and goes, you know what, I want to get pregnant in 6 months' time. What would give me the best chance to make sure it's as smooth as possible? What sort of things would you be discussing?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I mean, yeah, of course, where possible, it's fantastic if women with type 1 diabetes do plan their pregnancy. So I suppose given the importance of glucose, then the number one thing that we would be thinking about, and I say we, as in doctors, diabetes nurses, dietitians, together with the woman herself, would be how to optimize glucose management to try and start to get glucoses that are very close to a normal target range, really. And the reason for that is all to do with the fact that that helps baby both implant at the start of pregnancy and then develop normally in those first 12 weeks. So we would be aiming to get an HbA1c less than 48 millimole per mole. Now, in terms of an HbA1c is measured over 3 months. So I think that's really honestly the only reason why we say you try and do it for 3 months. It's to get that HbA1c down. But the reality is now we're using things like continuous glucose monitoring. We can see people achieving that time in range much earlier. And to be honest, I'm not sure how much legacy glucose control actually has an impact. It's probably much shorter, and it's probably very much at the time of conception. So I think that has an effect there.
So can I just ask a question there? Because just thinking in my mind from a previous conversation I just had with Jane Yardley, she's talking about sort of like the monthly cycle and how obviously there's the shedding of the lining and then the growing of the next lining. I guess in that case then for a full cycle, almost 28 days worth of that level of control, certainly for that lining would give you a reasonable opportunity, at least.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, certainly with you, I'm pretty sure that if you manage to keep your glucose in the target range for that month, and it happens to be the month that you conceive in, that would be all good. And thereafter, because actually it really matters thereafter. But it makes such a difference to actually start pregnancy with that tight level of glucose control. And we know that from a lot of national data that we've collected in the UK over many years now, showing that it really does have a difference on pregnancy outcomes. So glucose management is one. How we achieve that we'll probably come on to later, but I think it is worth just saying, you can achieve it with any form of insulin therapy. But right now, we would very much advocate that women who are planning pregnancy are actually supported to start a hybrid closed loop, so AID, prior to pregnancy. In terms of everything else, so that's the number one thing. Folic acid. So folic acid, there's actually very little evidence base for, but we do recommend a higher dose than you would normally get in a pregnancy vitamin such as Pregnicare. So it's actually 5 milligrams a day, and it needs to be prescribed. The reason for it is that folic acid protects against spinal cord defects and congenital heart defects. And we know that they're increased in women with type 1 diabetes, if they've got suboptimal glucose control, and it's really been an extrapolation that therefore perhaps folic acid at this dose may help. If anything, it really signals to me that somebody's planned pregnancy, because if they're on 5 milligrams of folic acid, they're taking it absolutely seriously. They're doing everything that they can. So we use that. Iodine, to be honest, John, I don't think about a lot, so maybe it's something I should. And as a dietitian, you might need to tell me.
No, I just as I think it's one of those things where in generally it's covered by what's in the drinking water and what's in the general food supply. It's not a something that would be a typical thing, obviously, but from obviously thyroid hormones, etc. Sometimes, yeah, that was just one thing I wondered. And the other one that I was really curious about is whether you have vitamin D, and the other one is omega-3. So like that's going from kind of like what would be the baseline to then sort of optimizing potential brain development. But that's obviously a very spurious kind of more of a mechanistic rather than an evidence-based thought. I don't know whether you have those discussions or not.
I think our dietitians do, and I think they're all good things. But honestly, what top trumps all of it would be glucose.
Major in the majors.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really what I would focus on most. I mean, a lot of people are vitamin D deficient, and so we would often recommend vitamin D while women are planning and then during pregnancy. And then our dietitians would probably talk about omega-3s and the benefits of that in the context of an overall healthy diet, and just thinking of, how to optimize a healthy baby as well as healthy glucose.
And obviously there'll be a lot of people who don't plan pregnancy. And I think it's also important because I always think of this conversation with regards to absolute risk versus relative risk, because obviously we're saying that this is ideal. And if you follow this, the chances of problems with baby and yourself are very, very low. And that's what we would ideally like. But also reality tells us that the planning pregnancy is not that. It doesn't happen all the time. So in terms of the absolute risk of those problems, how much are they elevated by not doing the planning and the glucose levels going high? Because what I'm trying to understand is you've probably got ladies listening to this who go, I didn't plan pregnancy and I was absolutely fine. And they were probably absolutely fine because it's not like if you don't follow those things, it's going to be disaster and all these things are going to happen. It's kind of like if the absolute risk is only down at 1% and then you go up to 5%, you'd rather not increase by 4%, obviously, but it's not like it's a total cause and effect if you don't go in there with optimal things.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. I think the first thing I'd like to say is please, if you are somebody who's got pregnant and your glucose control isn't where you would want it to be and it is high, please don't hesitate. The best thing you can do is make contact with your either your GP or preferably your hospital care team. And please be reassured, we look after an awful lot of pregnancies where that is the situation. You're not alone. About 1 in 2 pregnancies actually are unplanned, and we know that's the situation. And it absolutely does not mean that you're not going to have a successful pregnancy. We're really, we're thinking about it all the time and working with you for, at each point in pregnancy to minimize the risks. And you haven't blown it all if things are not right at the start. Now, that said, there are degrees at which different levels of glucose will impact on the baby. So we tend to use HbA1c to try and risk stratify. And an HbA1c that's, extremely high, so above, in the high 80s or higher, unfortunately that's really associated with a very substantial increased risk of miscarriage or congenital malformations for the baby. Now, when I say a substantial risk, we're still talking about it being about just under about 1 in 10 chance of either of those problems. months. So that still means that there's actually a really high chance of a successful pregnancy.
Yeah, I think it's so important to make that point, because obviously you want absolutely people to do their best and plan. But I'm sure there's also people, when they go and speak to their team and they're already pregnant, they probably think, wow, this is just inevitable. But it's still going from like a 0.5% chance up to 10% chance, which you don't want. That's like 1,000% increase. You don't want that 1,000% increase, but it's still absolute around about 10%, which is very high risk. But yeah, I just want to reassure those people, first of all, who are maybe in that space, that it's certainly not an absolute. And then second of all, there's no time like the present to improve it, because every bit of improvement you get from there lowers any kind of risk as you go along. So it's just, I think it's just such an important point to make.
John, that's a really important message, actually. And that's why I'd urge anybody just to get contact really, really quickly. If you're only, 2, 3, 4 weeks pregnant, then there's an awful lot that can be done to optimize things before baby comes out of that sort of 12-week period. So we really can make a difference very, very early on. The other thing to say is that even if there is an increased risk, we're always on the lookout for problems. So women will get viability scans to check to see whether the pregnancy is implanted. You'll get scans very early on to sort of check that baby's forming normally. And at each stage in the process, the woman would be involved in those discussions around what's going on. And in terms of congenital abnormalities or early miscarriage, that's only in the first 12 weeks of finding out that you're pregnant. And once you've got through that phase and the baby's then growing, then actually the risks then are different in terms of the HbA1c as well, because then we're really concentrating on baby's actual sort of growth.
So it's the key message out from there. If you can plan it, absolutely. Kind of major in the majors. Glucose control is number one, HbA1c to less than 6.5 or 48, as much time in range as possible. But even if you're not going to do it 3 months, your time in range or time in pregnancy range as high as close to 70% as possible in that month before will really set you up well. Get your folic acid at 5 milligrams. Do we know it definitely will improve things? We don't necessarily know, but why not take the risk? Do it anyway. Your vitamin D in check, and then obviously have a chance to speak to the dietitian and optimize some other things as well. And then if you then don't follow that path and you end up finding you are pregnant, as quickly as possible, get in contact with your hospital team, because number one, just as you said there, every bit of optimization that you do on the glucose control is going to benefit. You'll get access to scans to see what's going on, put your mind at rest. And also, even at worst case scenario with very high glucose control, there's still a more, like 80 to 90% chance things are going to be okay. So it's not like it's a done deal. So it's just putting those things in context is really important, and it kind of then leads on to that first trimester where I'm led to believe, is this where you get quite a bit of more insulin sensitivity than you previously had? So then all of a sudden you've optimized this kind of glucose, potentially if you planned it, or if you didn't plan it, you've kind of tried to optimize it, and then bang, all of a sudden hypos start happening all over the place.
Yes, completely. So it's actually a really, really unsettling period. Those first 12 weeks, not only do a lot of women feel a bit rubbish, to be honest, they feel largely exhausted, they may well feel sick, but then to add to the misery, really, glucose levels just go up and down. They're really labile, a lot more hypos, and it can be a really, really difficult and frustrating period for all women. Particularly those who've really tried hard to optimize glucose before, because you feel so frustrated that you've done everything right and now everything is no longer within your control, and it's really difficult. So a lot of that is actually sort of having to sort of ride the ups and the downs. It's a tricky period, but nonetheless, I mean, we've got various techniques that can help to manage that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Hypos, increased insulin sensitivity in those first 12 weeks can make it really, really hard.
So give me some playbooks then. Obviously, we've got people listening to here on injections, we've got people on standard pump therapy, and we've got people on AID systems. Directionally, kind of what percentage total daily dose reductions are you seeing from kind of, I know the average is hopeless, because if the average is 30%, someone's at 0 and someone's
Yeah.
at 50. But I think in terms of a direction, are we talking like 20-30% reductions in total daily dose, or not quite as much as that?
Probably not as much as that, actually. It is so variable.
Yeah.
And it's also so dependent on whether the mum's also getting nausea and can face eating as well. So that has such an impact. And some women don't. So actually they don't need to reduce their rates anywhere near as much as others. So I would say it's very, very individualized. And I would play it by ear. You know, if you're getting a lot of hypos, then obviously, you know, you would either drop, you know, you drop your background rate or your mealtime insulin if necessary to try and counteract that. I mean, I think one of the other things is if you're actually vomiting rather than just feeling nauseous, and you don't necessarily know you're going to keep down a meal, then that's really tricky for your insulin. So whereas normally we'd want you to take your insulin, you know, your bolus before you eat, because you get a much smoother glucose profile. In the first trimester, you sometimes can't do that, and you're having to take it after. And so you will have less perfect glucose over that time. That said, I think it is worth saying that for your basal rates, the going on to a closed, you know, a hybrid closed loop is brilliant at dealing with it, particularly if you're on a hybrid closed loop system that's incredibly adaptive. And there's not all of the algorithms the same, and I know we'll talk about that later, but you know, that really does make a difference. I think early on we're seeing that the ones that are more adaptive and can forget the sort of the days that were earlier and adapt to sort of the changes going on actually offer an awful lot of stability over that time.
And what kind of, obviously, from what I'm hearing there, is obviously the level of individualization is huge. The variability in food intake, glycogen stores, things have changed. How frequent during this 12 weeks is the lady in contact with the team, making adjustments and tweaks and things? Like, what's the frequency? I guess it will depend on which service you're in, right? A little bit as well.
I think it would be very service dependent, and also, I mean, I'm just thinking about my own clinic. Then actually, we would probably keep in contact. It's depending on whether you're struggling or not, every 1 to 2 weeks in that first trimester. It's if you've got glucose control that's, you know, a bit higher and we're trying to get it down, then often that support as well over this time, even though it's variable, is really important, because we know that if we can get your glucose as close to normal as possible by the time you leave that first trimester of pregnancy, that will have a big impact on baby's size. So it's really worth us investing in those first 12 weeks. And for a lot of women now who aren't already on a hybrid closed loop system prior to pregnancy, we're also putting women onto it at the start of pregnancy. So ideally, you know, within those first few weeks of them finding out they're pregnant, we're putting them onto a pregnancy specific hybrid closed loop. And then once they're on that, or somebody who's already on it at the start, actually things are much more stable. But I probably wouldn't go monthly at that point. I'd probably be 2 weekly in that first trimester.
And I'm right in saying, as you mentioned before, the time in pregnancy ranges on millimoles 3.5 to 7.8. So is that 60 to 140 milligrams per deciliter? Yep. And you're aiming for 70% in that range, right? So I mean, just from a general population type 1 diabetes specific, that the sort of similar time in type range is 50% to get in there, and people really struggle to do that on a consistent basis because insulin only isn't fast enough in general from the outside. So you're kind of then having to go, okay, not only I'll give you 50, you got to do 70, and you're still on insulin only. So what are some of it? Well, I will get a bit more into tactics, but I'm just interested, you know, kind of what your cells from the insulin adjustment perspective, and also the lifestyle stuff that's really going on at that point to promote that. What sort of things are being discussed to go, okay, we know this is challenging. We're suggesting from a lifestyle and insulin mix, these are the type of behaviors and lifestyles that will get you a greater chance of being there?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the overriding thing that we're all discussing at the moment is putting somebody onto a hybrid closed loop honestly, because that takes a huge amount of the burden off, and you've got your best chance of getting that 70% time in range very quickly once you're on it, or once you're on a pregnancy specific one, and we lower the target glucose and things like that. And honestly, that has been transformative, John,
Yeah.
at helping women achieve those glucose targets really early at the start of pregnancy. Now, if you're not, or for whatever reasons, not using closed loop or don't want to use a closed loop, then it is more challenging, and it does involve a lot more decision making and adjustments, as you say. So in the first trimester, it's sort of eating little and often.
Yeah.
Maybe having to take the bolus after meals just to try and get some insulin, etc. Maybe lowering the basal rates initially. I mean, at that stage, women can still exercise. I'd say it's so variable with everything
Yeah.
else that it's not something that I use particularly to try and keep the glucose down, or would advise on at that stage of pregnancy, but it depends, again, a very individual choice. But obviously, if you are doing exercise, then that will keep the glucose a little bit lower and a little bit more stable.
Yeah, so I mean, that's some of what I've been involved in. That would be probably, as a dietitian, my go-to would be, I'm not saying exercise, I'm talking about walking for
Yeah,
10 to
yeah,
15,
absolutely. I guess that's what I mean, really.
10 to 15 minutes walking
Yeah,
after eating. It's
after meals,
such a
yeah.
huge
Yeah.
amplifier of whatever insulin you've given, making sure, number one, it doesn't get degraded by the kidneys before it has a chance to work. And then second of all, you're increasing the speed of absorption, especially if you've had to give the insulin after, because you're not sure whether you're going to get it down. So I think, yeah, I mean, if you obviously hybrid closed loops would be extremely beneficial, but on top of that, so just this simple 10 to 15 minute walk after, or just moving, not sat on your bum, which is easy for me to say because I'm not the one pregnant, I'm not the one feeling nauseous, I'm not the one who's like maybe feeling not great, and to get up and walk for 10 minutes, I'm sure there's people that's shouting at me going, you don't know what it's like. I absolutely don't know what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, the really unfair thing is that often women really, really crave the high glycemic index foods or the beige foods in that first trimester, and it's like the body's conspiring against everything that they're trying to do, so that can be really, really difficult. But I think the good thing to say is it's usually, the vast majority of women, that stage is very, very short-lived. It goes very fast, and then once women come out of that sort of 12, 14 weeks, it's a different landscape again.
So let's say that we're now gone insulin sensitivity, we've sort of made some adjustments, you got there, and then, as I understand it, trimesters 2 and 3 is where the insulin requirements start to climb quite considerably. And from what you said before, I think I heard you say at this point, high glucoses, especially during this period, is going to overfeed the baby and potentially lead to a lot bigger baby. So the real challenge here, it sounds like, is as the insulin resistance goes up and the insulin requirements going up, is like proactively keeping on top of that, which presumably can get out of hand if adjustments are not made frequent enough.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, if you're on a pregnancy specific hybrid closed loop, then the reality is that will be adjusting your basal rates, and it also makes an adjustment for your meal times as well. And the more regular they are, the better that is at adjusting for it. So we find that really where the increase is needed is with the mealtime insulin. And we find that can increase up to anything between 3 and 5 times what you would normally expect to take. Now, that can be really difficult if you're somebody who's experienced hypos and you're looking at it thinking, am I really increasing my insulin that much? So that's really scary, but that is normal. So we see that very, very much so. And actually what we're finding now is that, again, most women would be on a closed loop now at this stage in pregnancy, and we're finding that actually you can strengthen the insulin to carb ratios much earlier on, and then they seem to stabilize out. And that's different from what we used to say. We used to sort of increase it incrementally every few weeks, and we're finding we're not needing to. You can do it right at the beginning, and then they seem to be a bit more stable.
Okay.
The other thing that really helps as well is trying to align the way insulin works with the glucose peak of the meal. And so pre-bolusing, now that you're not going to throw everything up, would be ideal. So I mean, we'd normally say sort of 15 to 20 minutes anyway. As you get into the second trimester, that may need to be 30 minutes pre-meal, and in the last trimester we used to find that it used to be about 45 minutes
Whoa.
before. Now, the reason I say used to is that now that we've got women who are on a pregnancy-specific closed loop that's already starting to anticipate mealtime glucose rise, so there's already some insulin there working. We're finding that maybe 15 to 20 minutes is actually doing the trick most of pregnancy. So we weren't expecting to see that, but that seems to work.
Okay, so you started like with 30, 45 minutes, saw too many hypos early, and it was like, wow, we need to actually change our old methodology because something is different here.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
yeah.
So someone's like, I can imagine that someone comes in and they go, okay, my carb ratio is 1 to 10. Okay, we're kicking into the second trimester. When you take it down to 1 to 4, you're like, what? You joking me? But
We do
again,
more
you know,
gradually than
yeah,
that.
you go. But I'm talking over a space of weeks. But even to just to even conceptually think that I'm going to go from a 1 to 10, I'm going to end up on a 1 to 3 potentially is kind of like, yeah, it's a mind blowing kind of situation. But it's interesting to. I think it's also really nice if there's people listening to this that that's the expectation. So when it comes, you're ready for it, as opposed to being like, whoa, because you're bound to think, I'm not going to do that because that's going to lead to hypos. They just had hypos in the first 12 weeks, and now you're saying do this. That makes no sense.
So that's another really good thing. There's a real reluctance, and we get that because, of course, you don't want to be hypo all the time. And actually, all these things are playing red flags to all the behaviours you've learned about giving your mealtime insulin and what works for you. And but the reality is, it tends not to in pregnancy. We do tend to get over it, and it is absolutely, a key thing. One thing I want to say is that not everybody seems to need it. So I do still come across people where, and I don't know the reasons why, but actually they don't seem to need quite as much of an increase. So I would say, don't worry, no matter what it is. The reality is it would be very individualized. What's right for you is right for you in pregnancy. It may not be the same for another woman.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole point of this podcast, The Glucose Never Lies, is you observe, you see what happens, you make a change. You see what that change does, you observe, and the glucose will tell you what works and what doesn't work. And I think that's such an important point from an individualization perspective is have expectations, but really the glucose levels will be your guide in terms of what works and what doesn't. And so just interesting to get that. So we've got pre-pregnancy sorted, we've got the first 12 months, and now we're just sort of discussing the second and third trimester. You've got this elevation of insulin resistance, likely increases in insulin either via, if you're on a pregnancy-specific closed loop, it will do a lot of that for you. If you're not on injections, you'll have to be a little bit more proactive. And it's also that bolus situation. Like, it just makes me think, wow, in that third trimester, you are literally living your life by diabetes. You're thinking, I'm going to eat in 40 minutes, I have to give my insulin, I'm going to wait round, and I'm going to cook, and after another 40 minutes, like, oh my God, there's like, there's so much to think about. Oh my God.
Honestly, it's the hardest thing, which is why I say, technology, particularly closed loop now, is really, it's a game changer for a woman in pregnancy. We've shown in the work that we've done when we were, originally researching this, that actually it really does have an impact on reducing that huge burden that we've been aware of all the time, and the responsibility on a woman. She's growing a baby and is aware that every little thing she might do has an impact on this baby that's incredibly precious, and taking some of that weight off has just been fantastic. To be honest, we saw it when we first introduced continuous glucose monitoring, that actually, we were a bit worried, is this too much information or not? But actually, no, it's transpired it's not. It's really helpful. And we saw a lot of benefits from that. But it's over and above that with the pregnancy specific loop. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds hard work. It sounds really hard work. And I think being able to alleviate some of that, obviously, with continuous glucose monitoring, but then obviously in a hybrid close would be amazing. But if you don't have that, at least you'll be able to learn fast. And that just brought me to one consideration or question, because something that you said was, I can imagine people who are super, not even anxious, but they want to do the best for their young person. Are we talking here a game of averages, i.e. if you average 70 to 75% in time in pregnancy range, that's good enough? And actually, if you have the occasional blip out here, that's just part and parcel, we're not as worried about that? Or are we worried about both? Or is it more like the major in the majors is the average? And if you can get the cherry on the top with a couple of knocking it off of the occasional spikes, that's great. But get the averages sorted first, and then think about the other bit after.
Yeah, I'd say get the averages sorted. So that's what we're looking at. And I would say, I mean, honestly, I look at sort of usually 2 weeks and what the averages have been in that. And if you're managing to get close to 70% time in range or more than that, then that's where we've got the evidence to suggest that actually it's going to really improve pregnancy outcomes. It's something that I see a lot, is that for whatever reasons, and there are a lot of them, the glucose will spike. And there are some people who are terrified that going out above the target range of 7.8 to 8 or 9 is going to be catastrophic. It's not. Okay, for the baby, it's not. What really would be a worry would be sustained high levels of glucose, because glucose can be toxic to the baby at very high levels. Yeah, and particularly in the context of being unwell as well, and then the risk of ketones and ketoacidosis developing, which can come on a bit earlier in pregnancy. It is slightly different, so we urge women to act much earlier.
So what's the advice around that then on a pump then? So obviously, I'll give you the standard for the children who we support. If you've been above 14 for 90 minutes, we're suggesting to sort of change the cannula at that point and not wait. Are you stepping in earlier than that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the advice I would say, so it's still just checking that the pump, so the importance of pump safety can't be underestimated for anybody who's on either a pump or a closed loop. But ultimately you've got to think, first of all, is there a cannula issue? Get that sorted. We would encourage women, if assuming that that's not the issue, to bolus. There are various tools on the systems that you can use to boost your glucose in, boost your insulin at the time as well, so use that, but actually not sit on things too long, and to look at it also in the context of how well you're feeling. So if you're feeling under the weather, your glucose isn't settling down, check for ketones, and we would say, certainly if they're 1.5 or above, then actually you need to be seeking medical advice. And that's a much lower threshold really than outside of pregnancy, where we'd be looking at 3 really. So do something early. Most maternity assessment centres should be expecting, or should have, a protocol to follow for somebody who presents like that. But that's what we would urge, is to actually get yourself in. There may not be somebody or time to sort of seek advice from, but yeah, do that, because ketones, or the risk of ketoacidosis to a pregnancy, is not good.
So we have a successful delivery. Everything's all good. And then what happens in terms of the insulin requirements once you've finished? Because I'm picturing my wife here, who's just given birth to, obviously, 2 times, one to Jude, one to Grace. Exhausted, totally exhausted afterwards. It's like such a challenging experience, and obviously then potentially breastfeeding, potentially not breastfeeding, and just a pure tiredness. And then obviously when you got type 1 diabetes, your insulin requirements have just completely changed from being quite high to presumably dropping off.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. So once the baby's been delivered, and then the placenta, so the placenta has to come out as well. And once the placenta's out, then mum's insulin requirements will drop to what they were pre-pregnancy. It's as instantaneous as that. And so you have to prepare for that with whatever form of insulin that you're on. Now, a large amount of women with type 1 diabetes, for a whole variety of reasons, including what they would prefer, will end up actually with a caesarean section, and often what we call an elective caesarean section, so one that's planned. So actually there is the opportunity, because it's a more controlled environment, to actually just prior to that already change on your pump. You can have sort of postnatal settings on your loop. You can go to postnatal settings, and then obviously if you're on multiple daily injections, just get ready to reduce that back down. So I try to make a record of what women are taking at the start of pregnancy, so I've got some reference point to go back to. So it might be worth just keeping a note of what your basal rates used to be. But even so, even if we don't have that, then I would pretty confidently reduce somebody's basal insulin down by 50% and put their insulin carb ratios way back down to what they were, and often take a little bit extra off as well, particularly if they're breastfeeding, just to minimize the chances in that first postnatal period of being hypo all the time. Nobody wants that.
And what's the difference between someone who breastfeeds and doesn't breastfeed with regards to changing regime?
Yeah, so again, it's individualized, and also breastfeeding's not always the most straightforward thing. It can take a good few days before milk comes in, and you then, once that's sort of in full flow, then you're utilizing calories very differently to those initial few days. But I mean, somebody who's on, say, 1 unit for every 10 gram of carbohydrate may need to go 1 unit to 12 or 1 unit to 15. And just make sure that they've got snacks around as well. For breastfeeding, because baby's going to be using up a lot of that energy.
Brilliant. That kind of really gives us a nice layout of ideally before, first, second, and third trimester, and then obviously after delivery considerations, what's happening physiologically, what we're expecting directionally to happen with the insulin requirements, food behaviors, changing bolusing timings. There's all sorts of things in there. Obviously, are presenting a real challenge. Talk glucose testing. So if you've got available finger pricks versus CGM.
Definitely CGM. So, and I say that because we did a trial called the CONCEPTT trial a few years ago now, that compared, did a randomized controlled trial comparing finger prick to continuous glucose monitoring. And we were able to show that not only did mums get much better glucose control in pregnancy and much more time in the pregnancy glucose target range, but importantly, it had a big impact on the outcomes for the pregnancy. And by that, it was things like preterm delivery, size of the baby, so baby was less likely to be big, and also it substantially reduces the amount of time a baby spends on neonatal intensive care. And we, as a result of that trial, we actually introduced it then across the UK with NHS England, and we've got national audit data showing that that's been borne out in real life. So we can see that this has had a substantial impact on improving pregnancy outcomes for women with type 1 diabetes. So that's the plug for CGM.
So I mean, that's pretty clear, isn't it? I mean, you've got conceptually, it makes sense because you get feedback and you can see the data and you can make the changes, but there's a difference between conceptual and reality. You've shown it in randomized control trials and now you've shown it in real world audit data. It's kind of the whole trifactor is there. You've got mechanism, you've got in, the randomized control trial, all sterile world, and then we've got real life data that totally tells it. So that is a clear story. CGM is a clear winner. Okay, so let's talk about
can I add one?
Yeah, of course, yeah, go for it.
Actually, we do work in an NHS where actually money is a constraint. And we also work in an NHS where there are a lot of bad news stories, again, about maternity care. And I think what we've been able to do with continuous glucose monitoring is improve maternity care for women with type 1 diabetes, but also it saves the NHS money. So if all the women with type 1 diabetes in England use CGM, it saves about £9.5 million per year to the NHS. So I think that's a win, personally, all round.
That's a total win. I mean, you usually don't get something better for cheaper. And that is very, very rare. So it's actually, yes, the CGM itself might be a slightly bit more expensive than finger pricks, but if you look at the total cost and what it means to the NHS on a whole, if you're like £9.5 million, that's massive, isn't it? So you've got the cost
effective, which is what people look for. It's cost saving.
Yeah.
I mean, how amazing is that, really?
Yeah,
and then huge. The impact it has on families and pregnancy outcomes in the baby.
And presumably as well from reviewing people, it's like time coming into hospital. Because I know we did some work with children and young people being able to download at home or automatic upload versus coming in and having your thing downloaded. You can see it online and like save you a million travel, parking tickets, annoyance of coming in. You can just do it from afar.
Oh, it's transformed it. Honestly, women used to come and sit in a hospital waiting room for 3 or 4 hours after struggling to park their car every week for me to look at their blood sugar book. I mean, how embarrassing in hindsight. The other thing is, of course, it coincided with COVID, and I have no idea to this day how we would have got these women through pregnancy if we'd not already. It was just we were using CGM and we could access everything remotely. I mean, how lucky were we that we could do that? I mean, it coincided beautifully, but now it's a lot of it can be done remotely. Yeah.
So definitely CGM wins over finger pricks, so let's go for that. But obviously, if you don't have CGM wherever you're listening there, obviously regular finger pricks, you just have to do a lot of them to learn, but it's still possible. Obviously, still possible. So let's get on to insulin therapy. So obviously, multiple day injections is better than 2 injections a day. Yeah, that's pretty clear. And then what about not hybrid closed loop therapy, but injections versus standard pump therapy? Is there much difference, or is there not much difference?
Well, if anything, and I suppose I'd probably say there's not much difference, but if anything, it looks in the data that we've got as though pumps actually don't do as well through pregnancy as somebody who's on MDI. Now, we're never really sure why that's the case. It may be that people become very reliant and think that technology is doing everything, or it's complicated to adjust and maybe we don't make enough adjustments. I don't know. But the reality is that when we split it up, it doesn't look as good for the generic pump compared to doing multiple daily injections in pregnancy.
I mean, to me, it makes a lot of sense for a few reasons you've just said. It makes a lot of sense. Number one, you haven't got the issue of cannulas kinking. So you take out all of those times where you get a kink cannula across the board because you've got a steady amount of background insulin. So you take all those high levels out for a start, those really, ketone specific ones anyway. Second of all, as you said, when you've got a basal rate to adjust, a carb ratio to adjust, a correction factor to adjust, as well as lifestyle stuff, you've got to have a team which is so on point with what everybody's doing, because if someone's adjusting basals and someone's doing correction factors and someone's doing carb ratios and you haven't really got a coherent process across teams across the UK, it's that is an unbelievable amount of training to get everyone doing the right thing. So to me, if you just got, it's either we just take the Lantus up by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 and adjust the carb ratio, it's almost easier for consistency across the team.
Completely agree. And I think that's what it is. It is very, very hard. Actually, there's so much to adjust and it isn't done very well, actually, by anybody.
Yeah, it's just hard. It's hard.
It's so complicated. It involves so much effort. So that, again, is why, thank God, we've now got hybrid closed loop systems that take a lot of that out of it.
Yeah. Okay, so then we come on to the big question. So obviously now in the Western world, and likely most of the people who are listening to this are sort of in a place where they have the fortune of being offered a hybrid closed loop system. I'm just going to say the 4 ones that we've got available in the UK, because I think that is fairly consistent across most of Europe. I know there are other systems that are available with limited data, but I'd rather not speak about those because I don't like speaking about things where I don't understand the risk. So I'd rather speak about those. So if you're kind of thinking, we've got in the UK on the NHS framework, you've got the Omnipod 5 system, you've got the Cambridge system, you've got the T-Slim Control IQ system, and you've got the Medtronic 780G system. So you said pregnancy-specific ones. Can you bracket those ones into which are and which aren't, and why?
I can. So I think because of the unique nature of pregnancy, because of the need for really, really tight glucose control, right from the start of pregnancy, that's sustained all the way to the end, because that has an impact on outcomes. We need to make sure that these systems, first of all, have been tested in pregnancy and shown to be safe and effective. Okay, so not all of these systems have been looked at in pregnancy. One of them, I'm not sure. Let me think. I'm going to say this wrong. Let me think about it, John.
It's okay.
Ask me something again. I've stumbled.
It's okay. That's fine. I'll lay out in another way. Okay, ready?
Go on.
So we're now on to hybrid closed loop. So we're sort of saying that maybe multiple day injections has a benefit over standard pump therapy, but it certainly doesn't over hybrid closed loop from what you've alluded to. It's kind of pregnancy specific. So I'm going to lay out my understanding of the available systems for pregnancy, what I understand the indications to be from CE marking, and then something a little bit about the sensors to try and frame this discussion, because every person is going to ask a simple question. Well, what is the best system for me, or what is the best system on average for pregnancy? So as I understand it, in the UK, we've only got 2 that are indicated for pregnancy. One which has been indicated for a long period of time, which is the Cambridge system, which I believe has randomized control trial evidence. It has a multitude of evidence now from audit data, etc. So that one's got a solid, robust amount of evidence behind it. And then we've got the recently approved 780G, I think just in July, where I don't think the evidence is as robust from my understanding. So they would be termed as the ones that are indicated. The ones that are not indicated from CE marking, as I understand it, are Omnipod 5 system and the Tandem T-Slim. So just on a pure indications basis of what has some data, you would be leaning towards the two that have the indication. But then between those two indicated ones, there is a difference in functionality and also in terms of level of data behind. So can you speak to a little bit about that?
Yeah. Okay, so they've both been tested in women with type 1 diabetes in pregnancy. And when that trial's been done, it's basically shown that they are safe, as in nothing awful happens to mum in that pregnancy. Now, whether they're effective at improving over and above what we've already got, so standard care with CGM and either multiple daily injections or pumps, is the bit that's really interesting. And I think that's where the two, it separates out the two. So the CamAPS system was the first one to be licensed for pregnancy, and it was developed in the UK and has about 15 years of peer-reviewed, published data looking at every step during pregnancy to make sure that it has been developed for pregnancy to achieve these really tight pregnancy glucose targets. So that's all out there. It's been checked. It was initially inpatient studies when it was on a tablet and the algorithm was being developed, all the way through to checking that it worked during labour, if women needed to be given steroids, if they were threatened at risk of having the baby early, and that it would cope with all of that. So it's really been a two-way process of developing it for pregnancy. And then I suppose the culmination of all of this many years' work was the ADAPT trial, which was a randomized controlled trial led from the UK, which was using the CamAPS FX algorithm. And that showed that no matter what a woman's HbA1c was at the start of pregnancy, whether she had been using pumps or MDIs, that actually switching to this system at the start of pregnancy significantly improved mum's glucose control by time in range in pregnancy. So that was really, really clear. That was actually the primary outcome of the study, and it aced it. And if you look closely at the data as well, although it wasn't what we call powered to look at this in terms of us being able to say, yes, it was statistically significant. But if you look at the data, you can see that using this system, we got the lowest rates of large for gestational age that we've ever seen in any study or in the UK from using it. It lowers hypertensive disorders of pregnancies, it halves, and again we very rarely would see that. The women weight gain can be a real problem in pregnancy because women are constantly just trying to keep their glucose stable. But what we could see was that compared to using CGM or pens and pumps, that the women gained 3.7 kilos less. That's a whole baby less weight gain using this system. And then we've got the evidence showing that actually it has a huge impact on reducing burden. So altogether, this looks like a great system. Oh, the other thing I should say, also reduces neonatal intensive care admissions and neonatal hypoglycemia. So it looks like it's the full package, and it's been developed for pregnancy. It's a system that is very clever in the way the algorithm works, because it's got something called exponential forgetting. And that means it puts a lot more emphasis on the most recent lot of glucose data than it does on something that was a month or two ago, which, as we've discussed, given how changeable everything is in pregnancy, that's really handy. And that's what gives it, in part, some of its adaptability. The other thing is it has the lowest personal glucose target. So the ability to set a really low glucose target for the algorithm to work towards, and it's likely that that's advantageous in pregnancy as well.
So that's down to 4.4 or 80 milligrams per deciliter, which compared to the other systems is at least 1 millimole per mole if not more, lower. And obviously what you're describing, as I understand it, is if you're trying to get below 7.8 on average, 1 millimole when you're going between 4 and 8, that's 20%. That's 20% like better opportunity to sit in that space, which is obviously what you described there for a randomized control trial. You've got the mechanism, it improved time in range and reduced mean glucose, and then you have the results as well. You have the results from maternal, gestational, maternal outcomes and baby outcomes. So that's clear, and that's obviously why it got the indication for pregnancy specifically. So that's one with the strongest data. Obviously,
without the strongest data. And then more recently, the Medtronic 780G was studied in a randomized controlled trial again called the Circuit trial. There are differences in the characteristics of the women that were entered into the trial. So they largely were women who were already using pumps, and they were largely women with pretty good glucose control judged by HbA1c at the start. But what was really disappointing about it was that the women didn't manage to achieve a significant increase in the pregnancy glucose target time in range. Now that matters because we know that every 5% increase in the time in range of pregnancy has an impact on pregnancy outcomes and neonatal outcomes. So the fact that this is a system that doesn't improve that, in a randomized controlled trial is a bit concerning. It's safe, but it's probably just not going to offer more. And I'm always on the lookout for things that are going to offer more because we really want to improve, pregnancy outcomes and a woman's experience in pregnancy. What they were able to show, and they really looked at the data, was that it managed to achieve a bit more time, so about 20 minutes more time in the glucose target range overnight. But that's probably not enough in the big run of things to have an impact on the pregnancy outcomes. It didn't look in detail at that, and it wasn't powered, a bit like ADAPT, to look at that. What we could see looking at it is that women gain weight. And we've also got some real world data now from a group in Spain that have looked at this in detail, where Medtronic was used a lot, CamAPS has been used. But actually the differences in terms of gestational weight gain are quite stark. So women will gain almost 11 kilos in a pregnancy on one of these other closed loop systems. Now that's an awful lot of weight to gain. They're not achieving the time in range until right at the very end of pregnancy, and they are having bigger babies than perhaps we've seen for a long time. So there are some, I think if a system hasn't been developed specifically for pregnancy and the algorithm adjusted, then I think that they are not necessarily all doing the same job in the context of pregnancy.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that I certainly like to speak about on the glucose level eyes is guidelines and CE marking, specifically CE marking, for a long history with CE marking, is a set of people who are they are regulating the use or the suggested indications for a device. They're not necessarily interrogating or scrutinizing the data in terms of what is best practice at the moment. So the way that I understood that from what you just described is we have the Cambridge system, which clearly has randomized control trial evidence and national audit evidence that we have big improvements of what really counts, which is baby's health, mum's health, and clear glucose outcomes, the mechanism behind it. Whereas obviously for the 780G, we have parity to MDI and CGM and pump, but no improvement from a glucose control perspective. And the other signals that you'd really like to move, the actual maternal and baby's health, don't really change either. So if you're weighing that up as a person or a clinician, obviously there's a clear first choice there for you to be talking about, to be doing. And until the data suggests otherwise, CE marking or no CE marking, that you go with what the data shows. And CE marking isn't a clinical appraisal of data, it's a marketing authorization. It's just very important to be clear of that. There's a difference between market authorizations and clinical data spoken by someone who's been involved in those trials and has lived and breathed it for a long period of time. I think it's just important to be totally clear with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. And that's certainly what we're seeing. And I think it's really difficult. Actually, a lot of clinicians don't necessarily know the papers or the data in detail. And people are very swayed when something's got a license for pregnancy or whatever. But actually, I think that it is nuanced. And ultimately, in the UK, we want to do the absolute best for our pregnant women with type 1 diabetes. We've got a track record of doing that. And why wouldn't we want to carry on doing that if we could? And so I think it really does matter at the moment. You know, in an ideal world, I want all systems to be available to allow personalised choice, you know, whatever works best. But, you know, we're not in that ideal world at the moment. A lot of these are developed outside of pregnancy, and everybody's going, oh, well, we use it in pregnancy, it should work. But, you know, that is not actually the case. If we look at the real sort of hard outcomes, then they're not all the same.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fair. And I know obviously we've been involved recently on writing a manuscript that's under review at the moment. And there's probably another mechanistic thing to consider for people that they definitely won't be aware of at the moment, is that although sensors are measuring the same thing in the fat tissue, which is your interstitial glucose, the algorithm that they use to then report a blood glucose estimate on your machine or to your automated insulin delivery system is different between systems. Some purposely aim for just below your venous glucose level, in ideal for safety purposes, so they don't over deliver insulin. And some of those continuous glucose monitors actually report a glucose on average that's above venous glucose, that actually sits between the capillary and venous glucose level, the level that the body's exposed to. So I guess the important point of that is, if you're systematically on purpose for safety reasons underreporting the actual glucose level, it means that when the glucose level tends to dip in a pregnancy specific situation, the algorithm is going to suspend sooner because it thinks it's going lower. So you're actually going to end up with less insulin than you need in that pregnancy specific range. Now, will that make a difference for the average Joe who needs timing range between 3.9 and 10? Arguably not as big of a deal. When you're talking 3.5 and 7.8 and the lowest the system can go is 5.5, that's a very different scenario. And I think, you know, people will be listening to this, well, what are you talking about? They don't measure the same thing. They measure the same thing in the fat tissue, but how they report it by their calibration mechanism, some report in the space between venous and capillary glucose and some report underneath. That's neither good nor bad. As long as it's accurate, it's fine. But where these things really play out is where you want to get that timing type pregnancy range. You're going to struggle to achieve that.
Yeah, completely. And that's something, honestly, that we're only just really getting used to, you know, as the doctor sort of dealing with these different CGM systems. I think there's a growing awareness of it. But yeah, as you and I have found out in our discussions, actually, where it really matters is pregnancy. And you know, when we look at these different trials, you know, they're not all comparing like, you know, with like. And it may well be that, you know, it may be a variety of things, but the CGM sensor used and where it calibrates to, you know, whether it's above or below venous, probably makes a difference to the amount of time in pregnancy range. And yeah, so it's probably quite simple actually, but so it may be that, yeah, well, we need to know, don't we? We need to know what the CGM's doing and what we can expect. And that way we can work around it. And that may be one way towards us being able to use all systems. Some of them will have to do a factor to make things, you know, work harder.
Yeah, and sort of at the infancy of this kind of understanding, because a lot of it's great that we've had this information for certain systems that have published data out there, but certainly within the UK, outside of the pregnancy sphere, we have a lot of systems coming to market that don't disclose their accuracy data, don't disclose where they calibrate to, and you have no idea where that's reading, which, like, on a personal level for me is particularly scary when you have indications from kids to the age of 2, but that's a discussion for another day. But I think what I'm surmising from what you've said is, if we major in the majors and we go with what we know, then the CamAPS system is first choice. It's just as simple as that. And unless there is an unbelievably good reason, i.e. you don't have that system available in your country, then you can't choose it. Of course you can't. Then the other system, go for it. Like, go for it if you don't have that available. But if you have that available, regardless of whether you prefer a tube or not a tube, if you're motivated for a 9-month period to go for it, is it worth having a tube for 9 months when you have research to suggest that on average, this system is the best thing for baby. It makes a lot of sense for clinicians to be very proactive and supportive with that, and people with diabetes to understand data is data, market authorization is market authorization. They're two very different things.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's interesting how often it comes up, John, about tube or no tube. And we get a lot of women who are on a patch pump and don't want to come off it for that reason. But that's that at the moment, and I'm not aware of any trials going on, is a system that has one of the highest glucose targets. It's at 6.1, so that's pretty high, and hasn't been studied in pregnancy. And so actually, for me, it's a no-brainer. I would want a system that's got the safety data, but also got that big evidence base behind it. And as I said, that's been developed for pregnancy. You're going to get more bang for your buck ultimately. And that's what we want. We want women with type 1 diabetes to have a successful pregnancy and reduce that burden of looking after type 1 diabetes.
Yeah, I mean, I just take this from a pure skin in the game perspective. If my wife, Danny, had type 1 diabetes and she felt pregnant, or we are going to plan a pregnancy, she ran a Cambridge system. She ran a CamAPS. Just simple as that. And if you ask yourself that same question as a healthcare professional or a person with diabetes, and if that's going to be your answer, then there is almost like a duty of care to have that discussion in those terms. Now, if someone decides that they want to not do that, but it's an informed choice, then it's an informed choice of this is your best option. We really strongly would advocate for this strong option. And if you're not going to go for it, of course, we're going to help you. We're not going to think bad of you for it. It's totally your choice. But it's our duty of care to inform you at present, as it stands, it is quite clearly the best option for everybody on average, kind of pretty much so. I think it's a fair point.
That's absolutely, and that's really important. Of course, we will look after you no matter what. We get that for a whole variety of reasons. There are things that are meaning that you don't want to do it. That said, we do, to make it easier, we have developed a switching fund actually in the UK. So one of the issues also that bothers a lot of I suppose hospitals and finance managers is to do with warranties around pumps, and people who are on one system have 4-year warranties. And to start off with, we were told, no, you couldn't swap for pregnancy to get the benefits because they've got a 4-year warranty, perhaps on a different system. But we've overcome that. So we've got NHS England have supported us. They've looked at the data as well, and have supported us to enable women to switch just for pregnancy if that's what they want. So you don't have to commit to it for longer than that, but actually then you get the potential benefits of this system in pregnancy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a major barrier taken out from a service perspective, which is amazing. I mean, the fact that NHS England would get behind that and develop a switching fund just tells you all you need to know. You talked about cost saving before. That cost saving comes in if you reduce the maternal and neonatal outcomes. So even from a selfish cost perspective from the NHS, which you have to do, it makes sense. So, make money available. Perfect. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. One thing I did want to, we talked about a bit of tips and control. So I've written down sometimes if I turned into a pregnancy diabetes dietitian tomorrow, these are the things from a lifestyle approach I would be thinking of. I would be interested to get your thoughts. And you've already mentioned a couple of these. Pre-bolus, you've already said, ideally, yes, 15 to 20 minutes, depending if it's possible. When you get out to second trimester, 30, maybe even 45 minutes, but not so much on the hybrid closed loop. So the pre-bolusing is key because we all know that food beats insulin. And what you also said was try and get the meal profile to match insulin. Well, we know that insulin peaks at 2 hours and lasts 4. If you have a mixed meal with protein, carbs, and vegetables in there, that matches that absorption nicely. Eating pure carbohydrate-based foods front up, high glycemic index, you're going to be struggling, aren't you? So you kind of got to go down the mixed meal from. Good.
And can I just interrupt to say that?
Yeah.
Even on the hybrid closed loop,
it's
brilliant at your background instinct, but don't forget your meals. That makes such a difference as to whether you're going to get the time in range. And going for the higher GI, where your insulin goes, not insulin, your glucose goes straight up, is just, you're never going to be able to match it, even with a hybrid closed loop. And one affected meal where you're not getting it right will lose you 5% time in range pregnancy that day. So mealtime behaviours really matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually when we call it fast-acting insulin, it's completely the wrong terminology.
Yeah.
It's medium-acting at best. At best, a fast-acting would be on in 5 minutes, off in 5 minutes, like it comes out of the pancreas. That's
and
fast.
even the ultra, the ones we consider ultra
Oh,
fast as well. There's nothing between them in pregnancy, honestly.
that's marketing at its finest. We've now got this ultra-fast insulins. It works 5 minutes. It gets there about 5 minutes quicker. Like, do me a favor. It's nothing in comparison.
Surely it'll work better in pregnancy because that's where the gains. Honestly, we don't get any difference. It's there's much more behavioural stuff you can do to get a better win.
Yeah, marketing at its finest, and also it means you can have a patent for another 7 years and keep charging premium prices, some may say.
Cynical.
Cool. Obviously, smaller carbohydrate amounts, if possible, in these mixed meals, spread out evenly, would be better than having big wodges in one go, just in terms of getting absorption.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And not too much carbs over in general, actually.
Yeah, so moderate type, so down towards 30 to 40% of intake. Yeah. Okay, perfect. And then finally, we also sort of mentioned if you can walk for 10 to 15 minutes after eating, especially if you've had beige food. Like if you've had beige food, the only way you're going to get on top of that is speeding that insulin up, and that is going for a walk. So if you're going to do it, just pencil in a walk like for 20 minutes afterwards. You give yourself a chance, basically. But a bit of activity anyway will be helpful. Okay, so we've got some kind of in-place strategies there, depending on what's happening. Wow.
The other thing I would say, actually, John, add to that is the more routine you get when you're pregnant. Actually, that's really helpful in pregnancy. It is no matter what system you're on, but again, with a loop, it's learning what you're doing, and the more predictable you are, and again with meal sizes and things like that, actually really does help. If you're after that extra time in range, if you're that kind of person, I appreciate not everybody is. But that matters.
Well, I think, in pregnancy, when people are going to all these weird and wonderful lengths, it's something worth considering. I think even if you're not on a hybrid closed loop, eating at the same time of day, similar amounts, allows you to learn what happens as your insulin sensitivity changes. If you keep those things constant, you're only battling one thing. You're not battling changes in insulin sensitivity as well as meal timings, as well as meal composition. You've got 4 variables you're trying to juggle. You've got very low chances of getting top. But if you only got 1 variable you're juggling, it makes it much easier.
The other thing that we found through doing a lot of studies over the years and collecting sort of dietary data as well is snacks. And that in pregnancy, a lot of women use the snacks as a time to go for something much more high GI. Please don't. It does mess everything up. Baby still, baby eats what you eat. And if it's getting a lot of extra sugar, then it will take that up. And low quality carbohydrates that fast release are not doing your baby any favors, honestly.
Yeah. I think that's probably all told for everyone, but even more so pronounced with type 1 diabetes. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for your time. So I'm going to try and summarize in a nutshell what I've learned, which is a lot in this session, and you can see how good of a job I've done at listening. We'll see. Okay, so what we're aiming for across the board, both before pregnancy, ideally at least a month, if not more, and all the way through, is timing type pregnancy range of 3.5 to 7.8, 60 to 140 of 70% is the aim. Any more you can get, the better, but as close you can get to that as possible. That's majoring in the majors. That is the glucose control specific stuff. In your pre-pregnancy lead up, folic acid 5 milligrams per day would be advantageous, as long as making sure your vitamin D is in check, and obviously having some dietary counseling will also help from there. That's kind of the lead up. As soon as you start, insulin sensitivity is really going to kick in for most people, so hypos is something to be aware of, and also nausea can make the bolusing challenging, so again, not have to bolus afterwards, just some difficulties from there. The big change is going to come from a psychological perspective. Once the 2nd and 3rd trimester kicks in, you've gone from being more sensitive to insulin to all of a sudden getting a huge insulin resistance, and you've got to scale up your insulin progressively week by week. And that's where these hybrid closed loop systems have really changed the game, because they get on top of it for you on a daily basis, especially on these pregnancy specific ones that are, I think you said exponentially or something like that, some fancy word, where it basically says whatever it's learned over the last 2 days is more important what it learned in the last 2 months. So it focuses on what's important right now, and that's obviously developed specific for pregnancy, so it gets on top of it nice and quickly. And then when you deliver, obviously it jumps right back to where you were before. So if you're on MDI, you just kind of have that regime in your mind, you get back to it. But obviously if you're on a pregnancy loop, you can, make some adjustments. And because most of the deliveries are cesarean, that can be sort of managed along there. And we also said planning is great, but if you don't do that and you're going high, get soon as quickly as possible, get the checks as quickly as possible. It's certainly not an absolute thing. It's just a relative thing. You kind of, as soon as you get in there and the faster you get things under control, the better it's going to be. And then we kind of finished off with saying there are some behavioral tactics, but really what's changed the game is two things. First of all, CGM changed the things for the CONCEPTT trial, which really kind of made a big step forward. And now we're on the second evolution of technology, which is hybrid closed loops. But if we're being honest with what the data says, a pregnancy-specific one that has all the data is the Cambridge system. So if you have that available to you, that is your go-to. And even in the UK, you can switch back to that for 9 months and then go back to what you're using before if you really want something different when you're not pregnant. But for those 9 months or that lead up to it, that would make the most sense. But obviously, if you don't have those options, you can make it work with anything. It's just going to be harder. And it's going to be more intense, and it's going to probably require a few more hypos. But it can be done because it's been done for years past. But technology is allowing, on average, it to be a smoother situation, but only if you're going to go with the one that delivers both that smoothness but also outcomes, which at the moment is a Cambridge system. If you have that available to you, if you're not available to you, just do use the best thing that's currently there and speak to your healthcare team. Have I done all right?
Oh, awesome. Yeah, really fantastic, John. I think you summed it up beautifully. And I think the one thing that I'd like to say is, please, if you're contemplating pregnancy with type 1, please enjoy it. Honestly, we're in a time now where that actually is possible. Your pregnancy, you can enjoy. The chances are you're going to have a fantastic pregnancy outcome. You've got teams that are looking after you. We've got the technology, but also we're really aware of, what could go wrong and are looking out for it and are holding your hand all the way through. So that sort of historical stuff that you've heard about, not having a pregnancy, etc. Tyrone, that's not the case. The vast majority are really successful, and the future's bright.
Well, I mean, that is a great note to end on. So I just want to thank you for first of all, your time today, but second of all, the work that you've done, what you've pushed for technology, making sure that the evidence base is kind of behind the new technologies, and then coming on to communicate it in such a clear and crisp way, in a way that is, really relatable. I'm sure there's lots of women, healthcare professionals, and people are partners with type 1 diabetes. If they give this a listen, they've basically got a playbook of what to expect. They've got a playbook of what's the best therapies available to them at the moment, and depending on whatever situation you enter this journey in, how to approach it. So I just want to say thank you. I'm sure the listeners will want to say thank you as well. And I'm sure I'll catch up with you soon over something or else, but I just want to say thank you, and I'll get you a glass of wine at that point.
John, thank you so much. It's honestly been an absolute pleasure just chatting with you about this, and just being able to get this information out to people. I hope it's really, really reassuring to people and useful. So thank you, John.
Perfect.